Welcome to the Sidewalk Weekly podcast, a show for people who are big on cities but short on time. I'm Vanessa Quirk. And honestly, this week, the world of cities still feels a little bit too pained to open with a joke.
Especially a bad joke.
Right, why cause more unnecessary suffering in the world?
More pain, yeah.
So we're going to get right into the show today and welcome our listeners and hope that you guys are all hanging in there this week.
Welcome to the Sidewalk Weekly, city lovers. I'm Eric Jaffe. We'll spend the next 20 minutes or so discussing the biggest stories from the urban tech world this week, and we'll chat with journalist Perla Trevizo. Help me with that one, Vanessa.
Perla Trevizo.
There you go. About how Texas cities are helping small businesses survive the recession. When time's up on a segment, you'll hear our little bicycle bell.
Bing!
This week, our top stories look at one city that entirely rebuilt its police force, a troubling new study on housing discrimination, and how face masks actually impact personal behavior.
Okay, let's get into these top stories then.
All right, our first story is about police reform. Mm-hmm. Of course, calls for police reform remain the biggest story in American cities this week. Right. Some cities are looking to Camden, New Jersey, which dismantled its police force 7 years ago and rebuilt it in a more community-oriented way. We had stories in CNN and NPR, among others, look at this case study in Camden. Mm-hmm. So, Vanessa, where should we begin?
Yeah, I think I'll just provide a little context first about, where the conversation is at this moment. So obviously in the wake of the protests, a lot of cities are starting to re-examine their police force. In Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered, the city council voted to dismantle its police force.
Right.
And as one council member said, they wanted to, quote, dramatically rethink how we approach public safety. And we're also hearing a lot of calls this week to defund the police in other cities all across the country.
Yeah, that's been kind of the big term this week that's gone around. And as we've been seeing, though, defund the police, it can mean a bunch of different things. And it doesn't actually have to mean eliminating a police force, although some people are calling for that.
Right.
One of the most common meanings I think people are giving to this phrase, defund the police, is actually more about reallocating resources away from the police force and towards social services that could help a community address some of its core challenges. Right. You had Los Angeles last week say it would move $150 million of its police budget to reinvest in community services. New York made a similar promise this week, so that's happening, yeah.
Right. And I think this idea of reallocating the resources, it's also very related to this idea of kind of unbundling all of the services that police officers are currently responsible for. So, for example, not having officers deal with people with mental illness or provide security in schools, right? These are things that officers aren't really trained to do, but they're asked to do it anyway. It kind of falls under their purview. So part of this defunding conversation is around how do we narrow the purview of the police department in a more appropriate way?
Right. And so that's how you get to Camden and Minneapolis, of course, taking this step further and disbanding its police department.
Right. So let's get to Camden specifically in New Jersey, which is a bit of a case study and it did happen 7 years ago, right? So CNN reported that before it made these changes, the police department there was really suffering from rampant corruption that had really bad effects on the community, right? And so in 2012, officials voted to disband the department. They didn't think it could be just reformed incrementally. And so they kind of started from scratch and they fired the entire squad. They asked the officers to reapply. For those officers who were accepted, the training then focused on community-oriented policing, right? Kind of having partnership with people over punishment. The approach also emphasized de-escalation, saying, use of force should be your last resort. And they also made sure that officer performance was no longer measured by the number of arrests. And so the complaints of excessive police force dropped 95% since 2014, which is huge.
Yeah, there certainly did seem to be some improvements. That's not to say that the change was perfect by any stretch. We heard that from both, the Camden police themselves and the community. Right. There's still improvements that need to be made. The racial makeup of the force doesn't reflect the city. We should also note Camden's a smaller city. It's smaller than Minneapolis, certainly smaller than New York and LA. So the things that work there might not translate necessarily. You had NPR speak with the former police chief in Camden, Scott Thompson, who led that reformed unit from 2013 to 2019, emphasizing an approach that turned the unit into what he called guardians, not warriors, and gaining the consent of the communities that the police works with to gain legitimacy and be seen as kind of community stewards, again, instead of warriors. And Thompson, he was talking about how there are serious conversations that can happen with respect to defunding the police because you get great returns on public safety when you use some of that money to invest in other social and community programs. And the quote I loved was when he said, "I would have traded 10 cops for another Boys and Girls Club."
Right. That's a great quote and a great point in that, when communities invest in these types of programs at the community level, you can have really great outcomes. And just to wrap this up, I do think that, among those social services that cities really do need to invest in is housing for sure. As we're about to talk about in the next story, if you don't invest in housing, it becomes a huge barrier to opportunity. So let's move on to our housing story here. So this story comes from our blog, Sidewalk Talk. Eric, you wrote about a new study finding direct evidence that rental property managers are effectively screening minority households into parts of a city that are more exposed to pollution. So Eric, this is obviously very troubling. How does this happen?
This is a working paper from 3 economists that came out recently, and they wanted to explore why minority households disproportionately live in parts of cities across the U.S. with greater exposure to air pollutants and greater proximity to toxic facilities. That's a kind of well-established trend across cities. So why is this happening? Housing discrimination is an obvious reason why this might occur, but it's hard to get direct evidence for housing discrimination. Certainly at a high volume of evidence, you can't do it from just statistical analysis because so many factors, social and economic, go into housing patterns across cities.
So if you can't rely on statistics, how did these researchers go about it then?
Right. So they used an experimental design, a controlled study to help isolate discrimination as the key factor here. And there are a few steps involved in that. The first is they used an online rental platform, and they identified nearly 3,000 rental listings from that platform in 19 metro areas across the U.S. Now, each of these listings, they went through and they said, with respect to pollution, is this a low exposure neighborhood, a medium exposure neighborhood, or a high exposure neighborhood? And then they created a set of names, and these names were intended to be identified as a white prospective tenant, a Latinx prospective tenant, or an African-American prospective tenant, and they approached each rental listing inquiring about the housing unit.
And as I follow, your blog post in the study, they wanted to see if property managers would respond to them differently just because they were approaching them with a different kind of name as a tenant, right?
Exactly. If they correlate that name with a certain identity, a racial identity, and you got a different outcome, it would be direct evidence of discrimination. And that's what happened, unfortunately, just based on this name in low exposure areas. So those are areas that have low exposure to pollutants, air pollutants, really healthier neighborhoods where you'd want to live.
Right.
When they sent inquiries from names associated with minorities, there was a 41% less likelihood to get a response about an available apartment than when they sent names that were designed to be identified as white.
Okay.
So in the low exposure neighborhoods, there was clear discrimination, but in the high exposure neighborhoods, these are more polluted areas, less healthy areas, there was no statistical difference.
Wow.
In other words, property managers were perfectly happy to respond to minority tenants in neighborhoods where there was lots of exposure to pollution, but they formed an exclusionary barrier when minorities were trying to live in a healthier neighborhood.
So it's a really troubling study. There is the small caveat there that, you did know it's not peer-reviewed yet, but it's still really troubling as we're thinking about all of these systemic barriers to creating more inclusive cities, right? This is the type of discrimination that impedes economic opportunity. It restricts your housing options. It exacerbates all the health disparities, which we're seeing play out right now in our society. What you wrote was that, if anything, the research results probably underestimate the level of discrimination that takes place because, discrimination doesn't only have to happen at the email level. It can also happen in person, right? When you're going to look for a place to rent. And I remember last year, I think Newsweek had a really big investigative report into realtors on Long Island, and they proved that discrimination coming from realtors in person is very common too, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I know we're running low on time here, but when we're thinking about our own work, trying to use innovation to create more inclusive cities, and we always try to kind of think solutions-oriented way during this show with our work and how to use innovation to help. Again, you come up a little short here when you're trying to do that because you can build as many new climate solutions that improve air quality as you want, but that is not going to get us all the way there unless we make these greater systemic societal changes that address the really historical the challenges that are facing our city's inequality.
All right, what's our last story, Eric?
Okay, so we will end on a lighter note here with a story from the Washington Post and Craig Timberg writing about an Italian scientist who has studied cow sociability in the past and who decided that once the COVID pandemic broke out, he would investigate how face masks change human sociability.
Right.
So, Vanessa, what do we start with here? The cows or the mask?
As much as you're dying to dive into the cows, Eric, let's
That's a leading question.
Let's start with the scientist named Massimo Marchiori. He's an Italian computer scientist, and he likes to use technology to study behavior, right? So in the past, he's used sensors to see, how the widths of shopping mall walkways might shape the way people buy. And he's used GPS technology in the past to see, what kinds of movements would lead to the best milk.
We could totally spend the rest of this show just talking about the cow study, but I'm going to let it go.
Yeah, let's leave.
I'm lactose intolerant.
Let's leave the cows in the pasture where they belong. So back to the task at hand. So when the COVID pandemic hit, Marchiori decided he was going to study social distancing, right? He said, everyone talks about social distancing, but no one has actually measured the amount of the distancing happening, right? So he created what he calls a social distancing belt, which is, it's kind of like a handbag or a fanny pack kind of thing with sensors, and it measures the proximity of the people around him, right? So then he walked through the streets of Venice, and sometimes he wore a mask and sometimes he didn't. And all told, he and his fellow researchers measured about 12,000 sidewalk encounters.
Encounters with people, not cows.
With people, not cows. Correct. No cows on the sidewalks of Venice, as far as I'm aware. So what Marchiori found is that the masks were actually really important. They served as a social signal, kind of like a reminder to keep distance. So when he wasn't wearing a mask, even at the height of the pandemic in Venice, he found that fellow pedestrians would come, within a foot of him. But when he was wearing the masks, people would drift twice as far. And he has a great quote in this piece. He says, "It's our humanity that is actually bringing us toward the virus. You have to take away a bit of humanity to become a bit antisocial to protect humanity," which I thought was great. A great quote.
Yeah, that is a great quote. And that's kind of the challenge we've all been facing for these past months now at this point. I thought this was just a really fun study to think about, especially as it impacts our daily lives. There are some caveats. I think, we should mention that you're already at a reduced chance of exposure to coronavirus, at least as far as we understand it. When you're outdoors and you're walking past someone on the sidewalk, it's still prolonged contact indoors that they believe poses the greatest risk. So, we should note that. Although it sounds like he studied indoor behavior as well, and indoor behavior also changed with masks. I'd be interested to see how this changes with time, right? As masks become the new normal, will people feel more comfortable getting closer to others who are wearing masks? Anecdotally here in New York, I think I've seen that. It seems like lots of people wearing masks, the vast majority, but you're seeing as it becomes more normal, will people start to kind of behave more normally, which could be concerning from a public health perspective.
Right. And the article does ask the question, are the results still the same if the country has mandated masks? And I believe there was kind of some indication that, it is different. It is different when everyone is required to wear a mask, then the results and the behavior aren't the same. So that's also something to really keep in mind here.
We know human behavior is very complex, but what we don't know is a lot about cow behavior. So we have a few more seconds here. Why don't you tell us what happened in the cow study?
Okay, all right. Just for the listeners, Eric,
Not for me. No,
let them
I'll
know.
turn the headphones off.
Yeah, for the about the cows. So this was an older study of Marchuri's, and his thesis for that study was that, the more active cows were, the more that they were, walking around the pasture, they would probably be healthier and their milk would probably be better and tastier. And that was measured by taste tests and lab tests. But the GPS data actually showed that it was not the more active cows that had the best milk, but the more sociable cows, right? The ones who hung out near other cows. So what I'm imagining there is that they were happier, they were chatting with their cow friends, and thus they produced the best milk.
And in conclusion, cows should not wear masks then.
That's the only logical conclusion to draw from that study. That is it for the top stories this week. As always, you can find the links to these stories in the podcast episode notes. In our next segment, we are going to talk with reporter Perla Trevizo. She just published a great piece on some cities in Texas that are doing their part to help small businesses. Back in a sec. You've probably heard about the federal program for small businesses and its accompanying controversies. In an attempt to make up for some of the program's shortcomings, the state of Texas created its own local version of the program, but that one has had some challenges of its own. We are joined now by reporter Perla Trevizo, who recently reported on this issue for ProPublica and the Texas Tribune. Perla, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Perla, thanks for joining us, and thank you for really great reporting on this issue. I wondered if you could, for some of our listeners who may not be familiar with the Paycheck Protection Program, can you talk a bit about how it left some small businesses behind, especially small businesses that have been owned by people of color?
Yeah, so PPP, as it's known, was meant to help businesses retain their workforce to avoid having them go on unemployment. What happens is that when the program first launched, you had a lot of really big companies, those that were better prepared, had contacts with banks and relationships, go for that money. And so it was out within 2 weeks. And then as Congress put more money into the program, a lot of small businesses didn't really know how to approach it, didn't have those relationships, or, thought the money was out, or it was too cumbersome for them to apply. And while it affects all businesses, a lot of research has shown that especially those owned by minorities and those very, very small businesses don't necessarily have all the documentation that's required, or, even connections with banks and financial resources to even help them get into the door.
Right. So you outlined there's some of the kind of shortcomings that accompanied that program. So how did local governments in Texas kind of step in to fill in some of those gaps?
So what we saw happening here in Texas was that as local governments starting to notice that small businesses were being particularly hit by the pandemic and the stay-at-home orders, you had counties such as Bexar County and Harris County dip into their general fund or sales tax or economic development funds to start putting in some money to make available to small businesses in the form of loans. So in essence, they created their own version of the PPP, and they contracted with nonprofits or organizations that had experience in doing this to put some money back into small businesses' pockets, especially those that had been left behind by the federal program.
Can you talk about how we would balance the challenge of needing a fast support system with the problems of first come, first serve?
I think that was the biggest thing, because if you are trying to save a small business, they don't have months and months to sit around and figure things out, right? So when the local governments were trying to put money into those small businesses' pockets, they knew that speed was key.
Right.
And so one of the fastest ways to do this is first come, first serve. But once again, it benefits those that once saw, happened to see it on TV or happened to hear about it or see it on social media and got their documents ready. The example of Harris County, I think, is very telling that, in 28 hours, they got more than 7,000 applications asking for $150 million when the program had only $10 million available. So even at the local level, you're leaving a lot of people out. And if you were one of the lucky ones that happened to have everything in order and find out about this program, then you got your application in. But if you did not hear about it in time, or you did not have your documentation to apply, then once again, you're being left out. And they do recognize this. And, the commissioner I talked to, he said he didn't want to have, I'm paraphrasing, but, be perfect, be the enemy of good. Right. And they were going for a good program. What a lot of these local governments are doing now, they're using the COVID relief money from the federal government to do grants. So those generally cannot be used for loans, but now they're trying to distribute portions of that money via grants and introducing more equitable ways of doing it, giving people a certain period of time to apply, making sure that they work with grassroots organizations that can actually target those harder to reach businesses. But in the end of the day, it's millions of dollars compared to the billions of dollars in the federal program, right? So it's still yet to be seen how big of an impact these programs can have.
Do you think that cities and counties outside of Texas could roll out similar programs? Like, is this a model that could be replicated?
In order to see the benefit of replicating this program, they're going to have to really track how the money was spent and whether or not those businesses are still open. I think to begin with, the business owners I've talked to who benefited from the local program obviously are very happy. And for some of them, it was a lifeline. Right. But I think in the long term, it's going to be key that we have data to back it up, because it is millions of dollars. And for local budgets, that's not insignificant. And the other issue that you have is that you end up with this patchwork of programs where if you're lucky to be in a county with more resources, they're going to be able to launch a program like this. But if you're in a more rural place or a poor county that does not have those resources, then once again, you would be disproportionately impacted by this. So I think it's certainly an interesting idea to look at and keep an eye out for and see how it develops.
Perla, last one, and we'll let you go. You mentioned all the small businesses that you talked to for this story. Obviously, folks who are really struggling. Some of them might have gotten a grant or a loan. Some of them might not have. But either way, did you hear from them about other kinds of support that could really help them at this moment? Other things cities can do to get them back on their feet?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is information and how that information get to them. So I think government in general, and local government included, obviously, are still struggling to reach some of this less connected business owners who might not fit the traditional mold. And so I think having more information was something key to them. Also, one of the nonprofits that's administering one of the programs was talking about also financial literacy and get them up to speed. So they're saying, especially with the digital divide, just as we hear about schools and school children being left out because of this digital divide, the same thing is happening with our small businesses. And so I think another benefit of managing these programs from the local level is that you can really work with nonprofits that beyond just providing the funds in the short term, they can also complement that with education and webinars to help them be more resilient for when we encounter situations like this.
Really great ideas that I think cities could step in and provide that service. So thank you so much for talking with us. This was so fascinating. Thank you,
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It is now time for our final segment, The Last Smile. In this segment, we set aside the depressing news of the week and focus on something happy for 1 minute each. Eric, what had you smiling this week?
All right, so I loved this headline, Why the Golden Gate Bridge is Now a Giant Orange Wheezing Kazoo. That's from Gabe Moline at KQED. Even capitalizes is there correctly. Well done, Gabe. I hate when people make that mistake. Gabe is writing that the Golden Gate Bridge started to make a long, loud humming, I guess, or wheezing sound when it was windy out.
Right. It's kind of louder than a hum. It's pretty loud.
It's quite loud, and it turns out it's the result of new railings that have been installed on the bridge that have these little slats that effectively turn the bridge into musical instruments. Designers knew about this in advance, but the sound is really loud, like you were saying, and it can be heard miles away. The reaction has been very mixed. I think my favorite line was, when you're driving along it and if you open your car windows, it makes you feel like you're driving into the opening scene of a David Lynch movie.
I mean, but that said, I am in favor of more infrastructure incorporating musical
More
instrumentation.
musical infrastructure?
Yes.
I think we'd all agree with that. All right, Vanessa, what had you smile?
So I really liked this article in the New Yorker from Hannah Goldfield. She was reporting on a little initiative in Astoria, New York, which was until very recently my home neighborhood, and I have a lot of love for Astoria in Queens. The owners of the Bel Air Diner in Astoria, they decided to kind of adapt to the pandemic, to adapt to the kind of lockdown measures. And, they were looking around their environs, if you will, and they noticed, we have a big parking lot right here. Let's do something with it. Now, usually I'm not a fan of parking lots. The urbanist in me says, let's turn them into something else. Yeah. But they're turning it into something great for the moment, which is a drive-in movie theater and restaurant, I guess. So you can take your car, sit in the parking lot. They've set up this big projector screen, and they have some really great movies like, The Princess Bride, which you can't not love The Princess Bride. Also, they have some great puns on the menu, which, you and I are big pun fans. So you can get the Breakfast Club.
And I think Judd Nelson actually serves it to you, if I read that.
On roller skates.
Yeah. All right, folks, time's up. Thanks for joining us this week.
If you'd like to read the stories that we discussed today and many more, then you should sign up for the Sidewalk Weekly newsletter at sidewalklabs.com.
We should note that the views expressed in the Sidewalk Weekly don't necessarily reflect Sidewalk's company positions.
And if you think that we're missing a perspective, then let us know. Send us an email or voice memo to podcast@sidewalklabs.com, and we might just talk about it in a future episode.
The Sidewalk Weekly is produced by Vanessa and me. This week's episode was edited by Andrew Calloway. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions, and our art is by the great Tim Cow. See you next time.
Bye.